It was the 25th of November, 1177, and across the plains of the Levant, the army of the most powerful sultan in the Islamic world marched with absolute certainty that it would crush a handful of desperate knights. Salah ad-Din, Saladin, commanded tens of thousands of warriors, light cavalry, mounted archers, the Sultan's personal guard, the full weight of an empire that had unified Cairo and Damascus under a single banner. Facing him stood an adolescent king, consumed by leprosy and a few hundred knights. There was no logic that could save the Crusaders. There was no strategy that could compensate for such an overwhelming imbalance of forces. So Saladin believed. But what awaited him was not fear. It was not surrender. It was something the Sultan had never witnessed on a battlefield. Something that Islamic chroniclers would take generations to describe without their hands trembling at the quill. And then the Templars charged, 84 Knights of the Temple bursting out of Gaza like a bolt of white steel. Their helmets blazed beneath the November sun. The red crosses burned across their mantles. The horses did not slow. The riders did not scatter. They did not turn left. They did not turn right. They drove forward in a perfect wedge directly into the center of Saladin's army, directly into his personal guard, directly into the heart of Ayyubid power. Lances leveled, shields locked, and on their lips the same words they sang before every battle. Non nobis domine non nobis, sed nomini tuo de gloriam. Not to us, Lord, not to us, but to your name give the glory. The impact was devastating. The Sultan's lines shattered, screams filled the plains, standards fell. Saladin's guard, those warriors who had never once retreated, fled. And Saladin himself, the man who had unified the Islamic world through sheer force of will, the man who would make the kingdoms of Europe tremble for decades, scrambled frantically onto the back of a racing camel and escaped with only a handful of men through the dust and chaos. When the sun set over Montgisard, barely a tenth of his army was still alive. The echo of that day would travel across continents and centuries, because that charge was not merely a military victory, it was the confirmation of something the Order's enemies had long suspected with dread, that there was something in those men of white and red cross that went beyond discipline, beyond training, beyond strategy. Something that made no army in the world want to face 500 Templars. This is their story. In the year 1099, the armies of the First Crusade seized Jerusalem. It was a loud, bloody victory, celebrated across Christian Europe as a miracle of God. But the euphoria did not last. Capturing the holy city was one thing, holding it was something else entirely. The Crusader states that arose in the Holy Land, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, were Christian islands surrounded by an Islamic sea that would sooner or later break through their walls again. And the pilgrims who crossed all of Europe to reach the holy places, those who sold their lands and left their families behind to fulfill their vow, found the road filled with bandits, ambushes, and death. It was the year 1118, or perhaps 19, depending on the source, when a French knight named Hugues de Payan reached the conclusion that someone had to do something. He was a middle-aged man, a nobleman of modest standing, a veteran of campaign and deeply devout. What he proposed was radical, even by the standards of the 12th century, an order of knights who would live like monks and fight like soldiers. Men who would take the 3 monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet whose mission was not to pray behind walls, but to protect pilgrims on the dusty roads leading to Jerusalem. Hugues gathered 8 companions, all knights, all willing to abandon personal wealth and individual glory in exchange for something they considered higher. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem granted them a wing of the royal palace built on the site of the ancient temple of King Solomon. From that place they took their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Templars. At first, they were laughably few for the task they had set themselves. They did not have enough armor. They did not have enough horses. According to some accounts, two knights sometimes shared a single mount, an image that would become the most famous seal in the Order's history. But they possessed something that mattered more than equipment. They had a reputation for absolute honesty, for boundless courage, and for a discipline that the other Crusader armies, chaotic and feudal, observed with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The Church took a decade to weigh in. In 1129, the Council of Troyes gave the order its formal recognition, and it was Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential monk of his time, who took up his pen and wrote the text that changed everything. De Laude Novae Militiae, in praise of the new knighthood. Bernard's words were not simple praise. They were a radical reformulation of what it meant to be a warrior in Christian Europe. A Templar knight, he wrote, is truly a fearless knight, protected on every side, for his soul is covered by the armor of faith, just as his body is covered by the armor of steel. He is thus doubly armed, and need fear neither demons nor men. With those words, Bernard forged the Templars into something new under the sun. They were not mercenaries. They were not noblemen seeking lands and plunder. They were warrior monks, men who had renounced the world, but who would draw the sword without hesitation in the name of God. In a Europe where traditional chivalry was often synonymous with arbitrary violence, this image of disciplined warriors in service of an elevated ideal ignited the imagination of all Christendom. Donations poured in from every corner. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued the bull Omni Datum Optimum, exempting the order from taxes and placing it under no authority but the popes alone. Within decades, the 9 knights who had lacked sufficient armor had become the most powerful military organization in the medieval world. But behind the wealth and the power stood something more important, the system that transformed the Templars into the most feared force of the Crusades. The rule. The rule of the Temple was the code by which every member governed his existence from the day of his vows to the hour of his death. A monastic code and a military manual at once, and that fusion was precisely what made the Templars so dangerous. The brothers woke before dawn for the divine offices. They ate in silence. They slept fully dressed and shod, ready to rise and fight at any moment. They could not abandon the battlefield without an explicit order, and even then they could only withdraw if the Templar standard had fallen and no other Christian banner remained under which to regroup. This rule was what terrified their enemies. A conventional army could fall back, regroup, flee, and fight another day. The Templars could not. Surrender was out of the question. Flight was grounds for dishonored expulsion from the order, a fate worse than death for a man who had consecrated his life to those vows. And on a battlefield, an enemy that cannot retreat is an incomparably more dangerous enemy than one that can. Over time, the order developed tactics that perfectly complemented that iron discipline. The most devastating was the squadron charge. Knights organized themselves into closed, rigid, perfectly coordinated formations. No one could ride ahead of the squadron. No one could deviate from the assigned line, and when the trumpet sounded and the entire formation launched into full gallop, the impact was comparable to a living projectile. Hundreds of kilograms of steel, flesh, and determination slamming into enemy lines at a single point, with a speed and force that few medieval formations could absorb. Templar war horses were the finest available, trained for years to hold their pace against screams, flames, and blood. The riders themselves wore layered armor designed to withstand multiple blows, and when the wedge punched through the enemy lines, what followed was methodical and merciless. Islamic chroniclers who faced them in battle described them with a vocabulary that wavered between fear and awe. They were the most dangerous men in the Holy Land, the most feared in the Crusades, and Saladin, the man who would become their greatest rival, would learn that truth in the most painful way possible on the plains of Montgisard. To understand what happened on the 25th of November, 1177, one must first understand the situation of the Kingdom of Jerusalem in those turbulent years. King Baldwin IV was 16 years old and already dying. Leprosy had been consuming his body since childhood. His hands were losing sensation. His face, half hidden beneath bandages on public occasions, bore the ravages of a disease that in the 12th century was a sentence of slow death. And yet that sick young man possessed a command of spirit that his contemporaries would remember for generations. Saladin had been in power for less than a decade. He had risen from a relatively humble position, a Kurdish general in the service of the Sultan of Syria, to become master of Egypt and much of Syria. He was extraordinarily intelligent, a politician to his core, and possessed a natural gift for uniting under his banner factions that had spent decades at war with one another. His project was clear: encircle the Crusader states, crush them from all sides, and reclaim Jerusalem for Islam. Montgisard was his first great attempt. In the autumn of 1177, the moment seemed perfect. A large portion of the Crusader army had marched north with Count Philip of Flanders on an expedition against Syria. Baldwin IV was blockaded in Ascalon with barely 375 knights. The Templars were besieged inside the fortress of Gaza. The kingdom stood militarily naked. Saladin mobilized an army estimated at between 20,000 and 26,000 men, and crossed the border certain that this campaign would end the Kingdom of Jerusalem. What followed was a lesson in the dangers of pride. Believing Baldwin posed no real threat, Saladin committed the fatal error of dispersing his army across the countryside in pillaging and foraging operations. His columns spread across the plains between Ramla, Lida, and Arsuf, like open fingers searching for resources, without the cohesion needed to respond to a swift attack. Discipline relaxed, horses rested, dismounted riders searched nearby villages for provisions. No one expected the Leper King to dare emerge from behind his walls. Baldwin emerged. He did not wait for conditions to improve. He did not wait for reinforcements that would take weeks to arrive. He issued the arriere ban, the general summons that obligated every able-bodied Christian man to rally to the royal standard, and rode out of Ascalon with whatever knights he had. Simultaneously, Odo de Saint-Amand, the Grand Master of the Temple, led his 84 knights out of the siege at Gaza and marched to meet the king. The combined column numbered approximately 450 cavalry plus several thousand infantry, a force that under normal conditions represented barely a tenth of what Saladin had in the field. But conditions were not normal. Odo de Saint-Amand was a man of few words and no fear. His contemporaries described him as arrogant, unyielding, and absolutely immovable. When the King of France once attempted to negotiate his release from an Islamic prison by offering the customary ransom, Odo replied that a Templar could only be exchanged for another Templar prisoner, never purchased with money. He died in captivity rather than accept terms he deemed dishonorable. He was precisely the kind of man the order needed for what was to come at Montgisard. The Crusader column tracked the Ayyubids northward along the coast, then veered southeast, moving through terrain that only those who had spent decades living in those lands could know as intimately as they did. Baldwin and his advisors, among them the fierce Reynold of Châtillon, Lord of Transjordan, understood that the only chance lay in striking Saladin's army when it was most dispersed and least prepared. They needed surprise, they needed speed, and they needed the Templar wedge to function with surgical precision. On the afternoon of the 25th of November, the Crusader vanguard sighted Saladin's columns near the plains of Montgisard, west of Ramla, in ground where marshes and topography reduced the advantage that larger armies typically enjoyed. Saladin attempted to urgently reconcentrate his troops. He organized a center flanked by 2 forward wings, one of them commanded by his nephew Taqi ad-Din, but it was too late. His horses were exhausted from the march out of Egypt. His riders were scattered across the countryside. The chain of command was fractured, and then the Crusader trumpet sounded. Odo de Saint-Amand raised the banner of the temple. The 84 knights closed their formation, shields aligned, lances leveled. A witness to the battle, preserved by later chroniclers, left a description that still shudders after 9 centuries. Spurring all together as one man, they charged, turning neither to the left nor to the right. Recognizing the body of troops in which Saladin commanded his knights, they approached it boldly, penetrated it immediately, and without pause, knocked down, scattered, struck, and crushed. The Templar wedge hit the center of Saladin's army like a battering ram against a wooden gate. The Sultan's personal guard, veteran warriors who had fought in dozens of campaigns, could not absorb the impact. The lines broke. Panic spread from the center outward to the flanks with the speed of fire in a dry field. When the Sultan's guard gave way, everything else gave way with it. Saladin was caught off guard in a way he would never forget. One of his own chroniclers, Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, recorded that the Sultan stood seized with astonishment as he watched his men scatter in all directions, flee in all directions, fall to the sword in all directions. He thought of his own safety and fled. He threw off his coat of mail to gain speed, mounted a racing camel, and barely escaped with a handful of men. While Saladin fled south, the battle became a pursuit. The Crusaders and their Turcopolar allies hunted the Ayyubid soldiers across 12 miles of open plain. Those who escaped the battlefield found no refuge on the road back to Egypt. The November rains had turned the roads into deep mud. The villages Saladin had plundered on the way south offered neither water nor mercy on the way back. And when the fugitives reached the Sinai Desert, local Bedouins seized the opportunity to enslave as many as they could catch. The Sultan arrived in Cairo on the 8th of December with barely 1/10 of the men he had set out with. The rest were dead, captured, or lost somewhere in the sands. That night in the Crusader camp, among the lit fires and the king's bandages, there were prayers. There was no celebration, no drinking, no raucous festivity, the kind that would have been forbidden by the rule of the order, and that in any case seemed out of place after a victory that everyone recognized as extraordinary, almost beyond natural explanation. Baldwin IV, the king who had fought with his body coming apart, prostrated himself before the relic of the true cross that his priests had carried into battle. The Templars, exhausted, covered in dust and blood, recited their prayers in silence as if they had just completed a routine duty. For the Islamic world, the defeat at Montjissad was more than a military humiliation. It was a fracture in the narrative of invincibility that Saladin had carefully constructed since his rise to power. His chroniclers labored for years to soften the propagandistic impact of the defeat, presenting it as a temporary setback, an accident of fate that would be redeemed in the future. But in private, Saladin understood the message with painful clarity. Never again would he disperse his army in enemy territory. Never again would he underestimate the speed and determination of Crusader knights. And in particular, never again would he underestimate the Templars. His relationship with the Order in the following decades would be a twisted combination of respect and hatred. Saladin knew how to recognize military excellence when he saw it, and the charge at Montjissad was the closest thing to tactical perfection he had ever witnessed. But he also knew that as long as the Templars existed, every campaign against the Crusader states would be infinitely more costly. They were the hard core of the Crusader army, the nucleus that did not break, the element that turned near-certain defeats into improbable victories. That was why, 10 years later when the tide finally turned, his response to Templar prisoners was unequivocal. On the 4th of July, 1187, at the Horns of Hattin, Saladin laid a perfect trap in return. The Crusader army, dragged into the desert by a desperate and ill-advised calculation, became trapped without water beneath the summer sun, on a hillside with no escape. The Templars fought even there, in conditions that would have broken any other army, dehydrated, exhausted, surrounded on all sides. But thirst and heat accomplished what no army had managed. By the end of the day, the Templars had fallen. Saladin ordered all Templar prisoners brought to him. He bought them from their captors with gold when necessary, and then he executed them all, one by one. It was not gratuitous cruelty. It was the cold logic of a strategist who understood that a freed Templar would pick up his sword again, that the order did not negotiate ransoms, that these men, as long as they lived, would be a permanent threat. In his own account of the battle, his chroniclers noted that the elimination of the Knights of the Temple was one of the specific objectives the Sultan had deliberately pursued. But the story of the Templars does not end at Hattin. It does not even end in the Holy Land. In the decades that followed, the Order kept fighting, rebuilding its forces after every blow, and riding alongside Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade. They raised castles that were at once architectural marvels and military fortresses, the Crac des Chevaliers, Chateau Pèlerin, structures that controlled trade routes and strategic passes along the entire coastal strip of the Levant. All of it came to an end with a brutality that still impresses even today by the cold calculation behind it. On Thursday, the 12th of October, 1307, agents of Philip IV of France received sealed letters with instructions not to be opened until the following dawn. On Friday, the 13th of October, they appeared simultaneously at every Templar commandery in the kingdom. The knights were arrested before they could resist, communicate with one another, or escape. The synchronization was perfect, an administrative coup executed with the same precision the Templars had always applied on the field of battle. Philip IV was deeply indebted to the Order, which had refused to extend him new loans. His inquisitors worked with brutal efficiency. Under torture, the captured Templars confessed to blasphemy, idol worship, and obscene practices. The confessions were almost uniformly false, extracted through starvation, sleep deprivation, and the rack. But they served their purpose. In the years that followed, dozens of Templars were burned at the stake. Pope Clement V, bent under Philip's pressure, formally dissolved the order at the Council of Vienne in 1312. And on the 18th of March, 1314, on the Ile de la Cité in Paris, the last Grand Master of the Templars, Jacques de Molay, was taken from his cell to be burned before the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Molay had spent nearly 7 years in prison. He had confessed under torture and then retracted his confession, condemning himself to death. As the flames began to rise, he is said to have hurled a curse upon Philip IV and Pope Clement V, summoning them to appear before God before the year was out. The Pope died weeks later. Philip IV died in November. The image of that old man in the flames, refusing to lie in the last moment of his life after having commanded the most feared order in the world, is so powerful that the centuries have not been able to erase it. The Templars had existed for nearly 2 centuries. They were born from 9 men without sufficient armor in the corridors of the Palace of Jerusalem, and had grown to become the most influential military, religious, and financial organization of their time. They had fought in hundreds of battles, from the deserts of Palestine to the coasts of Spain and Portugal, from the frozen Baltic to the plains of Syria. They had built fortresses that still rise above the Mediterranean landscape. They had laid the foundations of the modern financial system, and they had established a model of military excellence that other orders attempted to imitate for generations without ever quite matching. The question at the heart of this story has an answer that no tactical manual can fully capture. Why did no army want to face 500 Templars? It was not just the armor. It was not just the training. It was not just the iron discipline codified in the rule. It was something deeper, something that Islamic and European chroniclers alike perceived in their accounts without always being able to articulate it. The Templars did not fear death, and an enemy that genuinely does not fear death is the most dangerous enemy that exists. Not because it is invincible, but because in the crucial moment, when the battle hangs in the balance and everything depends on who retreats first, men who consider dying in combat to be the doorway to paradise are not going to retreat. Never. In that absolute refusal lies a tactical advantage that no number of men can compensate. The flame of Jacques de Molay went out in the cold of March, 1314. The order was erased by decree, its commanderies confiscated, its archives scattered. But something remained, with a tenacity that neither fire nor centuries could fully extinguish. It remained in the Arab chronicles that described the charge at Montgisard with stunned reverence, in the architecture of the circular churches raised in imitation of the Holy Sepulchre, and in that image that no medieval warrior could forget once seen, the wedge of white and red cross locked together like living metal, intoning non nobis, Domine as the horses gathered speed and the world trembled at what was coming. Because in the world of the Crusades, the Templars proved that there was something worth more than the number of men on the field. Total commitment, without reservation, without condition, to go all the way to the end. That commitment, forged in the pre-dawn offices, in the vows and in the rule kept day after day, was what turned a squadron of medieval knights into something the greatest armies in the world preferred to go around rather than go through. And in that difference between going around and going through lies the entire story of why, for nearly 2 centuries, the world trembled when the Templars charged.